He was young, full of spirit, and chasing something beyond the ordinary. One morning, he loaded up his bicycle with camping gear and pedaled straight into one of the Pacific Northwest's most rugged and mysterious landscapes, Olympic National Park. Then, without warning, he vanished alone on a secluded trail deep within the park. Jacob disappeared without a trace. There were no signs of blood, no footprints, no indication of foul play, just silence. Park rangers combed the area, helicopters scoured from above, yet the forest gave nothing back. Days turned to weeks, then months. Hope faded until, exactly 1 year later, something emerged. And what was discovered would challenge everything we believe about life off the grid. The first confirmed sighting of Jacob came from a man hiking near Indian Valley on April 5th. Then, in the early hours of the morning, a woman reported seeing someone hauling a red trailer up Firearm Hill. But it was the third sighting that truly unsettled investigators. A woman driving down the remote Solduc Hot Springs Road spotted Jacob pushing uphill, struggling under the weight of his load. He was just 2 miles from Highway 101. Later that same day, on her return trip down the mountain, she saw something that made her pull over. There it was, Jacob's bicycle and trailer, abandoned 6.3 miles up the river road. No sign of him. No reason to stop there. It wasn't a safe camping spot. It wasn't near a trailhead. It simply didn't make sense. And that's when the questions began, questions that would echo far beyond the trees of Olympic National Park. It wasn't even hidden. Jacob's bicycle and gear sat out in the open, just 10 yards from the road, and 20 feet from the rushing Solduc River. A blue poly tarp had been carefully spread on the ground, surrounded by neatly arranged camping equipment, almost as if someone had been preparing to repack or reorganize. But it was what lay beside the tarp that still haunts those who remember the scene. For arrows, standing upright, precisely lined in an east to west direction. What did it mean? Was Jacob trying to leave a message? A signal for someone who might come looking for him? Or was it something darker, something far more unsettling? Rangers discovered the eerie campsite the very next morning, April 6th. The bike was intact, fully functional, with air still in the tires. There were no signs of a crash, no damage, no disturbance. Most of Jacob's belongings were still there, untouched, and touched as if he had simply stood up and walked away from everything he owned, vanishing into the depths of the forest. Ranger John Bowie was the first to respond and quickly called in backup. Perhaps, they hoped, the cyclist had gone to fetch water from the river and slipped. The Solduc River is cold and fast, fed by the snowmelt from the peaks of the Olympic Mountains. In water temperatures under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, survival isn't measured. In hours, it's measured in minutes. Search teams fanned out, scanning the riverbanks and surrounding woods. But as they worked, a creeping realization began to settle in. This wasn't just a search for a missing man. Jacob Gray had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind no footprints, no trail, and no answers, only questions. And those 4 perfectly planted arrows, the arrows seemed to be pointing toward a truth one no one could explain. But a person isn't officially missing until someone reports it. And in Jacob's case, no one did for 3 long days. His bike remained untouched by the riverbank, while rangers assumed he had simply gone on a brief hiking excursion. It wasn't until April 7th that Ranger Brian Ray discovered a list of phone numbers among Jacob's belongings. He made a call to Jacob's sister, Mallory. The moment she heard the news, the Gray family was jolted into a nightmare. Jacob's father, Randy, didn't hesitate. He grabbed his wetsuit, jumped in his truck in Santa Cruz, and drove through the night toward Washington. Speeding through Oregon at 100 miles per hour, he was pulled over by a highway patrol officer. But after explaining the urgency, the officer issued only a warning: just be careful. When Randy and Mallory finally arrived at Olympic National Park, they were hit with another shock. No official search had even begun. Budget cuts had left the park critically understaffed. 2/3 of its law enforcement had been reassigned. At the same time, they were dealing with both a plane crash and another missing person. Jacob's case had been pushed to the bottom of the list. The Gray family was stunned. In a missing persons case, every second matters. And 5 days had already been lost. Refusing to wait, Randy suited up and dove into the frigid Solduc River. Himself, he searched behind waterfalls, under fallen logs, and inside eddies anywhere a body might have gotten caught. The cold was brutal, taking his breath away with each plunge. But he kept diving, kept searching, kept hoping. Yet the family's deepest frustration wasn't just the cold or the pain, it was the red tape. Olympic National Park operates like its own sovereign entity. Outside rescue teams couldn't help without official approval. Even the US Coast Guard, just minutes away by helicopter, was turned down. Volunteer search dog teams were offered but rejected in favor of approved park resources that never arrived. Eventually, Jacob's cousin Annalise confronted Ranger Ray directly. "We, as Jacob Gray's family, demand a full-scale, intensive search." The ranger's response, a simple, "Okay," but nothing happened. Undeterred, Randy pressed on. Wearing cotton clothes beneath a thin PVC rain suit, he trudged through soaking terrain. His feet stayed wet so long they began to rot. Devils. Club thorns tore through his gloves, leaving his hands raw and bleeding. Yet he never stopped. He never complained. Every day that Jacob wasn't found was another day he might still be alive, but the deeper they searched, the more disturbing questions surfaced. Why had Jacob told family he was heading east toward Vermont, but instead ridden west without saying a word? Why abandon his bike in such a visible place and simply vanish? What did those 4 arrows really mean? Were they a sign, a warning, or something more personal? From the location where Jacob's bicycle was found, the Solduc River flows 78 miles west toward the Pacific Ocean. If he had fallen in, swiftwater rescue experts believed he couldn't have gone far, a mile downstream at most. In April, the river is treacherous, swollen by snowmelt and rushing violently through sharp bends, jagged rocks, and tangled log jams. It was a watery maze of hazards, a place where survival was nearly impossible. Olympic mountain rescue volunteers finally arrived almost a full week after the discovery of Jacob's gear. They began piecing together clues. Near the riverbank, they found signs that someone had switched from hiking boots to lightweight running shoes. On a moss-covered rock, there were markings that looked like someone may have slipped. Roughly 30 yards downstream, they noted disturbed ground, suggesting someone might have climbed out. But tracking is never a perfect science. These findings were built on observation and speculation, educated guesses at best. The signs could have belonged to Jacob or to no one connected at all. Then came the moment that gave the family a sliver of hope. 2 cadaver dogs hid on a log jam downstream. Their handlers were cautiously optimistic this could be a major breakthrough. Divers returned to the spot again and again, but each time they surfaced with nothing. No remains, no answers. The scent could have come from decaying organic matter or even another source entirely carried by the current. Randy wasn't willing to rely solely on others. He dove into the cold waters himself. Tied to ropes, he lowered his body into pools behind waterfalls. He boogie-boarded through the North Fork of the Solduc River, stopping at every deep pool and cave he passed. Wherever a body might be caught, Randy searched it. The toll on his body was brutal. Covered in bruises from hitting submerged rocks, he was barely eating, drinking only from the river, and surviving on adrenaline and hope. Still, he refused to stop. Every pull, every crevice, might hold his son. A possible clue surfaced. Burnside shorts matching Jacob's size were found a few miles downstream. They were sent to the state crime lab in Seattle for DNA testing. But once again, hopes were dashed. The results came back negative. Another false lead in a case that seemed to be unraveling into nothing. By this point, Olympic National Park reclassified Jacob's case as a passive search. That meant no further resources would be used unless new information came to light. To Randy, that was unacceptable. If no one else would look for his son, he would. Personally. In a life-altering decision, Randy Gray left behind everything. He shut down his successful construction business in Santa Cruz. He sold the family home. He bought a diesel truck and a slide-in camper. And then he moved to the Olympic Peninsula. He was no longer just a father. He had become a full-time search and rescue team of one. As the months dragged on, the search widened far beyond the river banks. Jacob's sister, Mallory, remembered giving him a set of throwing knives for Christmas. They weren't among the gear left behind. Also missing were his crampons for alpine climbs, a warm jacket, and his backpack. These weren't small items, and their absence raised unsettling questions. What if Jacob never fell into the river at all? What if he had deliberately left his bike behind? That possibility haunted Randy. He began considering scenarios. He had once refused to entertain human trafficking, cult recruitment. Jacob was young, good-looking, and had done some part-time modeling in Santa Cruz. Could someone have spotted him, lure him away at 2 a.m. with a fake story about needing help? Randy walked the streets of Port Angeles in the dead of night, speaking with anyone who might know something: homeless individuals, addicts, drifters. There were whispers, supposed sightings, but nothing solid. Jacob had vanished completely. Mallory offered her own theory to her father. Maybe Jacob was just lost. Not in the wilderness, but in life. He didn't know what he wanted to do, she said quietly. Where he wanted to go, who he wanted to be. The state of the world had weighed heavily on Jacob. The family had seen it. He struggled emotionally after the divorce. Losing the home he'd grown up in had hit hard. His mother, Laura, admitted he was having a tough time adulting, trying to find his place in the world. The long bike trip across the country was supposed to bring clarity, a chance to reset, to find purpose and peace. But there had been signs, subtle, troubling signs. Among Jacob's belongings, rangers had found a Bible. One passage had been circled, Isaiah 30:2-14. The desert creatures will meet with the wolves, and the wild goat will call to its kind. The night creature shall settle there. Why that verse? What was Jacob searching for in those haunting, cryptic words? Randy didn't stop. He couldn't. He bought a small folding bicycle and boarded ferries to the remote San Juan Islands, checking organic farms, thinking Jacob might be living off the grid. Working under a false name, he returned time and again to the Solduc River, walking the same 12-mile stretch over and over. By now, it had become the most thoroughly searched mountain riverway in the region's history. By August 2017, Randy had been living out of his truck camper for months. He moved as the search dictated, sleeping wherever the next lead took him. For some, this life endless travel, no fixed address might have sounded like freedom. But for Randy, it was the opposite. He had lost his son, and nothing else in the world mattered. That August, a full moon rose over the mountains, blood red and filtered through the haze of distant wildfires. It was a moon that watched a father, still searching, still hoping, still refusing to give up. The wildfire smoke drifted down from British Columbia, casting a hazy red glow over the Olympic wilderness. Randy was staying at a place called the Barna Building, owned by Bigfoot researchers who had offered their help in the search for Jacob. Inside, the barn was a mix of the bizarre and the serious. Rifle cases leaned against the walls, headlamps, set charging, and plaster casts of massive footprints were scattered around. The people here believed in things others mocked, but when it came to searching the mountains, they were no joke. Derek Randalls and his Olympic mountain response team had covered over 730 miles on foot through uncharted backcountry, well beyond the edges of any map. If anyone knew the terrain above the Solduc River, it was them. They also knew the odds finding one person in that vast, rugged wilderness was next to impossible. Still, they never stopped. For 4 straight months, Randy had searched 12 to 14 hours a day. His body was starting to break down. His hands were worn raw, his feet permanently soaked, his strength fading, but his will never did. I didn't plan any of this, Randy said quietly. Jacob's my buddy. You think I want to be out here searching for my son? He kept moving because stopping men thinking, and thinking men facing the possibility that he might never see Jacob again. Randy still spoke of his son in the present tense. Jacob's mother, Laura, had begun using the past tense, that subtle difference between them, one clinging to hope, the other beginning to grieve, spoke volumes. I'm going to give Jacob this camper when I find him, Randy said. He'll love it. We'll strap the surfboards on top and just live at the beach. The search had taken over his entire life, but Randy didn't care. He couldn't stop. Somewhere out there, Jacob was waiting, dead or alive. And either way, he deserved to be found. Then, on Friday, August 10th, something changed. A team of wildlife biologists, hiking in the high country to study marmots, stumbled across something unexpected near the top of a remote ridge, high above Hull Lake, 5,300 feet above sea level and more than 15 miles from where Jacob had left his bicycle. They found human remains. The location was shocking in its isolation. Jacob wasn't near any trail. In April 2017, when he had disappeared, the ridge would have been buried under snow and vulnerable to avalanche. How had he made it so far? Why had he climbed deeper into the wilderness instead of following the river down to safety? The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Ranger Brian Ray told Randy to stay back. Let the professionals handle it. But Randy wasn't the kind of man to stay behind. What would you do? He asked, when does a dad stop being a dad? He raced up the mountain alone, but he was too late. On his way down, he crossed paths with a different scene just above Deer Lake. Rangers were performing CPR on a 29-year-old woman from Iowa who had collapsed on the trail. And once again, Randy found himself face to face with the rawness of life and death in the mountains. The woman from Iowa had gone into cardiac arrest. Randy stayed to help, taking turns with the Rangers, performing chest compressions. One of them had just come from retrieving Jacob's remains off the mountain. Despite their best efforts, the woman didn't survive. It was another painful reminder of how unforgiving these mountains could be. The official cause of Jacob Gray's death was listed as inconclusive. The Clallam County coroner identified his body through dental records. He had been found with insulated clothing, a cigarette lighter, food, and another Bible, this one belonging to his grandfather. He had everything he needed to survive. And yet he hadn't. Hypothermia was the most likely explanation. But that only answered how he died. It didn't explain why. Why had this strong, healthy, intelligent young man ended up on a barren ridge, miles from any trail, completely alone? Why did he plan an eastbound cross-country trip, only to head west? Without a word, why leave his bike unlocked, his gear spread out in plain sight, and for arrows planted neatly in the ground? Was he trying to communicate something? Most haunting of all, Jacob's final resting place may have been visible from the air if helicopters had been dispatched immediately after his gear was found. Could he have been saved? The mystery of Jacob Gray might not lie in the details of his disappearance, but in something much deeper. Dr. Robert Coster, expert in search and rescue psychology and author of Lost Person Behavior, offered a perspective that brought painful clarity. Children often go up, he said, so do people on a vision quest. Depending on what message they receive from God, I've seen people climb mountains. Jacob had been circling verses in his Bible, dark, symbolic passages about desert creatures and night beasts. His family had long worried about his mental health. The divorce, the loss of their home, the pressure of finding purpose in a confusing world. Maybe this trip was never about biking cross-country. Maybe it was a pilgrimage, a spiritual journey, a solitary search for meaning. The 4 arrows stuck in the ground? Maybe they weren't meant to guide rescuers. Maybe they were guiding Jacob, pointing him toward the place he believed held the answers he needed. Randy had said it from the beginning. Jacob would have gone up. Most missing adults head downhill, toward safety. Jacob had climbed towards something else entirely. In the end, on that silent, windswept ridge above Hull Lake, Jacob Gray found what he was looking for, whether it was peace, understanding, or simply an end to his struggle. We'll never know, but his story remains with us. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't about where someone went, but what was happening within them all along. The wilderness called Jacob Gray home, and in its own quiet, solemn way it gave him what he had been searching for. The tragedy is that it came at a cost his family will carry forever. Jacob's story isn't just about a disappearance, it's about a young man searching for his place in a world that had left him feeling lost and alone. In the end, he didn't find his answers in the pages of a book. He found them in the silence of the mountains, where the only voice that mattered was his own.